Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mārtiņš Vargulis. I am Deputy Director at Latvian Institute of International Affairs. I'm also a lecturer at the Rīkotājs University. And on the stage of the Enlighten, we have a topic to be enlightened. And the topic of this particular discussion is nuclear weapons. And I have to note that I'm delighted that, first of all, organizers of the festival LAMPA has accepted this topic, because when we came together with the partners and this particular discussion has been organized by two partners. One is Latvian Institute of International Affairs and Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. So when we started to think about the specific topic of the discussion that could be provided at Festival LAMPA, we came to the conclusion that nuclear weapons is something that has been missing for a while, but then after Russia's aggression in Ukraine and after the nuclear messaging, nuclear blackmailing, as one would argue, has been, I would argue, even in the public debate, a hot potato or a toxic issue. And there are a lot of speculations when it comes to the nuclear weapons, nuclear dimension in the current existing international security order. And therefore, in cooperation with the partners, we decided to enlighten, to raise awareness of those issues. And to do that, we have a distinguished panelist, and I will introduce them. I will start with the first one, Ambassador Baiba Braže, who is, of course, NATO Deputy Secretary General for Public Diplomacy. Promoted. Assistant Secretary General, assistant. But we would like to have you as a Deputy Secretary General. So then we have Rainer Meyer-Zumfelde, who is Senior Researcher at Kiel University Security Policy Institute and retired Brigadier General. And Imants Liedis, Senior Fellow at the Latvian Institute of International Affairs. Before I go and provide some introductory remarks for each of the panelists, one administrative note. This will be, as you already realized, this discussion will be in English. So if you need a translation, there are people providing headphones. Tātad, ja jums ir nepieciešama tulkošana, jo šī diskusija būs angliski, tad brīvprātīgais jums palīdzēs ar headfoniem, kur jums arī tiks nodrošināts tulkojums. And second, after the introductory remarks, of course, you will have possibility to raise your questions to this important topic. So, Ambassador Braže, I would like to start with you. Also, providing some aspect from the NATO as organization perspective. We are a part of NATO. We are part of a nuclear organization. What is the role of the nuclear dimension, particularly for NATO, and your assessment of what we witnessed in the recent 12-14 months?
Labdien, sveiciens Latvijas, sveiciens Cēsis, tāds prieks šeit būt. And hello everyone, great to be back in Latvia, which is my home country, obviously. And going back to your question, Mārtiņš, indeed, the nuclear deterrence, nuclear weapons, is a subject that worries everyone. People, whether we at NATO or anyone else, hate nuclear weapons. You know, it's the worst possible things that the humankind has invented. In the same time, it has been the guarantee for peace, the ultimate guarantee for peace and security of the alliance, of alliance's populations since the foundation of NATO. So when we speak about the deterrence or atturēšana latviski, it comprises an integrated nature. It means capabilities and resolve. And it applies to conventional, to integrated air missile defense, ballistic missile defense, and conventional forces, of course, but also to nuclear deterrence. So NATO's ultimate task is guaranteeing peace and security for its 1 billion citizens, now 1 billion citizens after Finland joined. Before we said almost 1 billion citizens. And making sure that the peace and security that has been there for 74 years ultimately lasts as long as necessary. So this guarantees, this deterrence that nuclear weapons provide is actually supported by the populations in NATO. We poll our audiences across the alliance regularly, and around more than 70% of people in the allied countries on average, when asked, while other countries have nuclear weapons, do you support NATO maintaining nuclear weapons? The answer, more than 70% of cases, is yes. So there is that legitimacy that the alliance gains from this understanding overall that we will not be in a safer place if Russia, China, or others have nuclear weapons, and we will not have them ultimately. There's also a high level of trust in NATO of being a responsible actor with regard to nuclear weapons and maintaining that capability, which also stems from the fact that we never brag about it. You will never see allies, be it Americans, French, or Brits, or those who are sharing so-called sharing countries where American weapons are stationed. We will never irresponsibly converse about them or brag about them, but ultimately, once a year, we run a joint exercise about which we also nowadays communicate to show that we are transparent, that we are open, that this is a routine nature of, again, NATO's mission to maintain that peace and security, and ensures that our key opinion formers, our publics, ultimately understand that this is not because we love nuclear weapons, nobody loves them, but because that is the ultimate guarantee for peace and security. It also prevents coercion, because our adversaries ultimately understand that there is both that capability and resolve to ensure, if necessary, the not only deterrence but also defense, but also that there is that genuine wish to engage in activities that lead to more transparency, verification, control, and confidence and trust building. And that is the area which worries us currently the most, because you would have also heard that Russia has stepped back from a number of international treaties that allowed verification, that allowed transparency and certain element of mutual confidence and trust building. So it is currently slightly more difficult to ensure that part of the mission. But we are not giving up. We are still making sure that at least some element of transparency, some element of a critical dialogue is there. So this is how NATO sees its mission. This is why we have nuclear weapons, and this is why allies work together, both with those countries that hold the nuclear deterrence capabilities, so the US, UK, and French independent nuclear forces, but also those countries that share, on whose territory Americans, together with those countries, are based, and who engage and who run the exercises all together. Because exercises, it means there are a lot of also conventional aircraft involved, a lot of air defense capability, a lot of ground capabilities involved, and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Ambassador Braže. Follow up, if I can, immediately. From the broader perspective, has, and in particularly in nuclear dimension, in nuclear thinking, last 14 months in any way changed the perspective of NATO looking at the nuclear weapons, nuclear dimension in how we strengthen our deterrence and defense posture?
Yes, it has changed. We have more openly communicated about our nuclear deterrence capabilities, and that came after Russia's re-invasion of Ukraine. I mean, already since 2014, of course, the whole threat assessment, the NATO strategic concept, the whole security situation in Euro-Atlantic region area had changed. So you will see that there is much more robust military capabilities that we communicate about following NATO's communication channels, but also in strategic communications, which is actions, images, visuals, words, also lately much more audio effects. So we demonstrate also very visually that we do take that action. There is an annual exercise called Steadfast Noon, and last year for the first time it was Secretary General himself who preemptively announced that that exercise will take place and explains the natures, the routine natures, the transparent nature, and the essence of the nuclear deterrent to our publics. And it was positively received from what we saw. Again, we monitor the information environment overall, but it also preempted Russian irresponsible rhetoric, because Russian GROM exercise, which also takes annually place in October, was coming. We knew it was coming. Russians were preparing. And the worst case scenario for us would be a reactive communication. Oh, NATO is running nuclear exercise as a result of GROM. So we made sure that we are there explaining, demonstrating that capability, both reassuring our audiences, but also making sure that what our leaders has called a threat to Euro-Atlantic security, Russia, that it would clearly see and know what NATO is doing. Overall, you would have seen also regular sort of public statements from NATO evaluating Russia's irresponsible nuclear rhetoric and clearly calling out those statements.
Perfect. Thank you. Coming back to you, in general, what is the perspective of one of the, I would argue, still one of the leading country in Europe and NATO? What is the role of nuclear policy from the Germany's perspective?
Yeah, first, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to talk about that difficult topic in such a nice environment. From a German perspective, I mean, we have been living with that challenge of nuclear deterrence from the outset in 1955, when we joined as the old Federal Republic, Western Germany, NATO. And in these years until 1989, we were not only the frontline state, number one, we were at the center of gravity against the Warsaw Pact for the forward defense of the alliance, at that time with 16 nations. Now we have 31, hopefully 32. It was very essential for the Germans in all these decades that we do convince the other side, the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union-led Warsaw Pact, that it's not a good idea to attack Western Europe, and that we should be able to deny not only a conventional attack, mass attack with that conventional superiority in these years, but also prevent any kind of war, including conventional war, by threatening them with a nuclear capacity, which would be convincing. Of course, we were and never wanted to be a nuclear power. That is, against the German history, a non-starter, taking the French and the British and others' concerns always into account. But what we did is we requested as the priority number one the Americans' extended nuclear deterrence. And under their nuclear umbrella, we were able to provide the bulk of the conventional forces for the defense of Western Europe. So we played a heavy conventional role. But again, the ultimate assurance for us playing that role was a credible American extended deterrence by nuclear means. And that doesn't come for free, it has a price tag. The price tag is risk sharing, nuclear risk sharing. And for that purpose, we had to provide to the NATO posture overall a German contribution. And that was huge also in the nuclear field. Many air wings, squadrons, ground-based medium-range missiles in the 1980s even. And in the very early years, so 1950s, 60s, when the people did not really understand what nuclear weapons mean, we had even tactical artillery with a very low range, so 30, 50 kilometers or so. We were very happy at the end of the Cold War that that was all not longer necessary, but just a minimum of nuclear deterrence contribution via nuclear sharing arrangements. And we negotiated in the NATO double-track decision in the early 1980s to remove the intermediate range nuclear forces. And to be frank, in the years 2010 to 2013, we were at the point where our Green parties and our Social Democrats and all other peace-loving people in the political spectrum were keen to withdraw the German contribution to the nuclear business in NATO by just letting it fading out with the tornado as the carrier. And then Putin started his first attack on the Ukraine. For Germany, a complete surprise. Did not expect anything like that. We saw Russia much more friendly as a partner and all that, and that changed everything. Since then, since 2014, we are back to the understanding we need to have nuclear shared arrangements, including from the Germans. We need to come back to a strong deterrence and defense posture with strong German contributions focused on northeastern Europe, Baltic states and Poland. That is what we are doing, and we are doing it including modernized nuclear contributions, the F-35. And that decision has interestingly made by the Greens and the Social Democrats. So they turned around in the right direction, supported by our opposition parties, the main ones, CDU, CSU. So we are now back on track. And I think this is very important. That is, but again, based on American nuclear extended deterrence. No other in Europe can substitute the Americans in that role, this nuclear umbrella. And we on our side, to keep the Americans in, need to share also the risks with that by being one of the nations who play that role in nuclear arrangements, which means 2 squadrons, an airfield, all the very cost-expensive assets, and much more. And on the having side, you are then better involved in all plans, discussions. You can make up your voice and say what you need and what you want. And that is what Putin has created, very much opposed to what he really wanted.
Regarding this one, the final point. Margaret Thatcher once said this famous quote that we are, with nuclear weapons, we are living in a safer world. But there is one rationale behind that all of the actors that have nuclear weapons are rational, right? Are we dealing with a rational actor? Are we completely excluding? Are we living still in a mutually assured destruction system from your perspective? Or we are not excluding the possibility of such a use of, be it, I'm not speaking about strategic, but also tactical nuclear weapons?
I'm very convinced that we are still dealing with rational actors in the nuclear level. I'm very convinced that there is no misunderstanding on mutual assured destruction, that both sides have a second strike capability. Who makes use of nuclear weapons first dies second. That is the point. What our problem is we need to deny the Russian leadership any option to decouple the European security from the American security in the nuclear business. That was our concern in the 1980s with that SS-20 and armament programs of the Soviet Union, which led us to do similar things on our side. Whatever we do here, both on the conventional and at the nuclear level, is aimed at the risk calculus of the opponent. He needs to understand that he has no advantage, that he will lose. If he goes nuclear, he needs to understand he destroys his own country, his own leadership, and everything else. And that works. I mean, we had seen in the recent 12 months, targeted at Germany, at Berlin and Warsaw. Continue. Yeah, it works again. We have seen so much nuclear blackmailing messages in the Russian media, talk shows, Russian Today and all that, aimed at Berlin and aimed at influencing the German public mood and discourage us from supporting the Ukraine. And that stopped now because there were 4 responses. The first was the Ukrainians themselves, who said, doesn't matter, we defend. We will continue to fight, period. The second was the American Foreign Minister Blinken, supported by a statement of his president, don't do it, saying that the Russians would inflict on themselves catastrophic consequences. And Petraeus, that was the third reaction, former general and CIA, had made it clear that the Americans would be prepared to react on a nuclear strike of the Russians on Ukrainian forces or whatever by destroying the Russian forces in Ukraine conventionally, including the Black Sea Fleet. And fourth reaction, which mattered from my point of view, that even China made crystal clear that they would not support any nuclear escalation on the Russian side. So it works. And since then, it has calmed down, that rhetoric. So that is for me clear. We need to stay calm and carry on.
It calmed down, but until the decision to locate nuclear weapons in Belarus. But I'm sure that we will discuss that. Imants, coming to you, 2004, we joined nuclear organization. What does it mean for, I would argue, small state as Latvia, and how, from our perspective, we perceive those issues?
Yeah, thanks very much, Martin. I think that it's important to recognize that, first of all, we do benefit from the nuclear umbrella provided by the United States in NATO. And so that's very important. So that gives us an opportunity to participate in the debate, and we should do so. But if we look at it from the more strategic level, I think there are also certain things that we can address as a member of NATO which could really help to try to make the world a safer place, which is what we're here to discuss in many ways. And that's how do we do that within the nuclear debates. And these are really, there are certain practical measures that I just want to mention that can be addressed on a general political perspective, and then I'll move on to some of the things that perhaps Latvia could engage with. So if we took a look at the general situation, then it's quite clear that at the moment we're living in a high-risk situation. There's never been such a risk since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 vis-à-vis nuclear weapons. And so that needs to be addressed. How can we minimize that risk? The principle that was outlined by the then Soviet leader Gorbachev and Nixon was that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. You can question whether that principle is valid today, but I would like to remind you that in January last year, which is a month before Russia's all-out war against Ukraine, also President Putin signed up to a statement affirming that that's the case, together with his Chinese, French and UK counterparts. So that principle is really important in trying to ensure some sort of predictability in reducing any threats that we have of a nuclear war. And I think it's important that we should also not dismiss the prospect of dialogue. Baiba mentioned in her intervention that there is some element of a critical dialogue which is still there between NATO and Russia. I mean, I think that's what she was referring to. I mean, I'm not convinced that that's the case, but I think that it's important that we should not close the doors on dialogue on such an important issue as the nuclear threat. And here, I suppose, we're referring more to the strategic dialogue, the strategic stability dialogue, which was agreed between Russia and the United States back in June 2021, which again was in a different era. But this included, at that stage, a commitment to lay groundwork for future arms controls and risk reduction measures. And that's what I think we need to focus on. And I think there's also the possibility for nuclear states to conduct what are called internal reviews of their own systems of control and command, how nuclear weapons could be used. And these could include steps to strengthen safeguards against cyber threats and unauthorized, inadvertent, or accidental use of nuclear weapons. So these are the type of issues that the nuclear states could address. The United States is carrying out such a review, and they're encouraging other nuclear states to do the same and share the results of such a review. And what's interesting is that the United States is also making, to my mind, important endeavors to try to draw China in to the discussion on nuclear weapons. We heard, quite rightly that China has, together with India, have both made submissions to President Putin about not using nuclear weapons. At the same time, we also know that China is considerably increasing the possibility of the number of nuclear weapons that it can have at its disposal. And of course, the only element of arms control that really is remaining today is the New START agreement between the United States and Russia, which expires in 2026. And there are United States efforts to keep that going and to draw China into discussions on a global level to discuss those issues. So those are some of the general political areas that could be addressed, that we could refer to. What can Latvia contribute to the debate? Well, I think what's very important is that, in fact, our knowledge of Russia, which I think has now been recognized since the 24th of February last year, we can use this to our advantage, and it can be used also in the nuclear debate by pointing out that we're aware of the extent to which Russia does bluff. Russia's use of disinformation, strategic communication, we have profound knowledge of this. This is a value that we can bring to the table when we discuss these issues with our larger partners. So that's one aspect that I think Latvia can bring to the table. The other thing is that I think it's very important that Latvia, as a member of the Alliance and the European Union, should keep in close contact with our allies about their strategic thinking on nuclear issues, so that we are engaged in the debate and we contribute to the discussions. Primarily, this will be the United States, given their strategic dialogue with Russia and their concerns about China's expanding nuclear arsenal. But I think we shouldn't forget the dialogue that we need to conduct with the United Kingdom and France. France, as we know, is the sole power within the European Union that has nuclear weapons and is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Both the United Kingdom and France, as we know, are present with their troops in our neighbouring country, Estonia, as part of the NATO presence. And I think that's also an important message, an important signal to Moscow that, look, there are two nuclear power countries of NATO that are on their border. And I think that especially the fact that France has opened the way for a greater European role and is seeking that role within Europe for Europe to play a larger role, I think we should respond to that. And I just want to close with a quote from Latvia's current foreign minister, soon to be president, in an interview in 2020, referring to the French contribution to nuclear weapons, he said that extended nuclear deterrence guarantees by France as part of NATO's nuclear umbrella could be a game changer. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Imants. Immediately you were speaking about that from...
Can I just make a precision?
Yeah,
quickly?
yeah.
Had Imants listened carefully, he would have heard that I didn't speak about NATO-Russia critical dialogue. But there is a critical dialogue among nuclear weapon states and Russia.
And that's the difference, right? But Imants, coming back to your point that here in the region, and I could subscribe to your assessment that we understand the mentality of our opponent. From your perspective, and being also as a former Minister of Defense, what is the aim of such nuclear messaging and blackmailing by Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think the aim is to, or was, to try to reduce the extent to which allies of Ukraine give them support, and you know they failed in that respect. One of the other aims was to, and this might be an aim of actually using a tactical nuclear weapon, is to destroy the will of the Ukrainian people. And it's quite clear that they will also fail in that, you know, even if they did use a tactical nuclear weapon. You mentioned the Belarusian issue, and I think that vis-à-vis Belarus and the way in which you know there's references to placing of nuclear warheads on Belarus territory, I think that this is probably more a message to say to Lukashenko that we're in control of your territory, that Belarus doesn't have a say anymore in what's happening in Belarus, rather than being a more of a threat, an increased threat to us, because as we know, they're already in Kaliningrad, you know, Russian bases that are capable of using nuclear weapons. And I'd also like to mention that, in fact, and this was something that was mentioned yesterday in a discussion in Riga, that Putin actually seems to be, you know, panicking in his use of nuclear rhetoric, because only a month after talking about the invasion, a month after the 24th of February last year, he was already talking of putting the nuclear weapons of Russia on alert, on high alert, when in fact they're already on high alert all the time. So that's an indication that you know, the guy is sort of in trouble with his failed policy of carrying out an all-out war against Ukraine.
Thank you, Imants. Now I'm opening the floor. I have a catch box, so I will throw to one who would like to ask the questions, and I'm sure that there is. I hope that there is. Yeah. First, please introduce yourself briefly and mention to whom you would like to ask the question, please.
Thank you. I hope this works. Yes, my name is Anastasia. I'm the student at Rīkotājs University, as well as working at SAIMA and Riga Council. So you were talking a lot about blackmailing, and my question would be, do you consider the deployment of weapons in Belarus, which caused a lot of fear, especially my family and friends groups, as a bluff? And I ask this question because since the placement of weapons requires a warehouse that Russian government, at least at the beginning, pledged on the 1st of July of this year, and although a similar warehouse in Kaliningrad has been under construction for about 7 years now, and respectfully, what are your thoughts on this case?
Thank you. I think Imants already touched upon, then maybe we'll start with the general and then Baiba on this topic. Yes.
Well, of course, it is not a positive development, and it increases risks, yes. So it would be better we don't have them in the first line, but more in the rear. But it is part of Putin's messaging. But I should recall 2 points here in this context. Number one, nuclear weapons cannot be used on the battlefield as we believed it in the 1960s and in the 1950s as a kind of super heavy artillery. That's not the nature of nuclear weapons. They are exclusively, I would say, political weapons, which you use for signaling and for coercion and for that kind of stuff. Secondly, what works against that is a combination of convincing, credible, conventional defense, including American troops in the front line, shoulder on shoulder with the others, so that the attacking power, Russia, knows from the very first minute an attack against one NATO member state is an attack against all of them, including the American, who are still the superpower, the Brits, the French, who are nuclear and P5, the Germans, who are heavy in economic and military conventionally. So that is the combination. And in order to have a convincing nuclear deterrence, that is important, you need to have the Americans also on the ground in the front line. That is your reassurance more than any other one. And that was the reason why the Germans insisted so heavily in all these decades to have 2 American corps in Bavaria in that layer cake, together with the British Army of the Rhine, the Belgian Corps, the Dutch Corps, and 3 German corps in between. To have that array of convincing defense conventionally and on top nuclear deterrence. And that works. Former Konrad Adenauer, our first chancellor, was once asked, how many Americans do you need to believe in credible US nuclear deterrence? And the answer was just 1 and his family.
Thank you. Please, Baiba.
Indeed, I think General Tupelde very well explained the logic behind nuclear deterrence, that it doesn't exist separately from the rest of the deterrence. It's really the concept of deterrence that requires conventional, the ability to show, to demonstrate that ability to project force, to have proper exercises, to have proper planning in place, to have proper signaling in place, but also indications and warnings. So when our military leaders say that we are not changing posture because we are ready, we know what we are doing, it comes from the whole bulk of evaluation on indications, warnings, on posture, conventional forces in place, IMD forces. So it means a lot. It's a short sentence, but it means a lot. So I would like to reassure indeed your family that what Russia is doing now by restoring certain facilities in Belarus and the loud announcements that in NATO it's watched carefully, that our intelligence, our military colleagues, everybody is taking it serious, but we are never going to escalate the rhetoric or posture or anything, because every step is important, every word is important, and we are not using nuclear rhetoric irresponsibly.
Thank you. Iman, something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add because, of course, it's the role of governments to reassure members of your family about, what is being said. And so I think it is important that the role of also the Latvian government is to explain what nuclear deterrence is about in simple terms, and also to really make sure that there's a balance between not creating too much alarm within a population, but also having a rational approach and referring to the bluff element of Russia, and so I think that's the governments themselves has an important role, just as the Assistant Secretary General at NATO for public diplomacy has a very important role and plays a fantastic part in explaining these issues to all of the member countries.
That's why I'm here. But also one word I wanted to tell you is when we discuss these famous regional plans, it's not coming out of nowhere suddenly, a regional plan that is developed. It's a process which started in 2014 when we saw, as in 1950s, in Korean War that conventional territorial warfare can advance quite quickly, where decisions had to be made how to defend Europe. And that led ultimately to Germany being accepted in NATO. It also led to nuclear planning, proper nuclear planning collectively among the allies, without France, because France has independent nuclear weapon capability and policy. And from 2014, it led to the change of NATO military strategy in 2019, which is it's a strategy, which then is dialed down into particular lower documents. So the strategic plan of secure Supreme Allied Commander, regional plans, domain plans, new force structure, where what is placed, how it's filled, new types of exercises, projection of force. For example, currently in the North Sea by the Norwegian coast, there is a big exercise taking place, which you might not see in the news. But US aircraft carrier group, Gerald Ford, is given under NATO command and control. And it has a huge force projection capability. It has deep precision strike capability. It works with the allies. It literally covers the whole northeast up until down in the South Atlantic, with its capability to defend, but also, if necessary, to strike. So that is a demonstration of deterrence as a whole. So, and that stems from this new type of missions that NATO has, that when we had the out-of-area operations, when we had the time and space to send few hundred people to Afghanistan at a certain time, for 6 months rotation, then send it again or not, this is not the time anymore. That's why the whole posture, the whole defense concept in NATO has changed. So it comes with new alert system, command control, everything. So it's a different type of world we indeed are living in, and it stems from that understanding that the security in Europe has changed, the security situation has worsened, that Russia is a threat to Euro-Atlantic security, as said in NATO strategic concept, but there is no direct military threat against NATO allies. There is no direct military threat because of this very consequential deep planning and capability and resolve.
Just a couple of words to give the audience. Yes, please, General.
Yeah, just one point in addition. I'm very convinced that the Baltic states are now much more secure than they were in 2014, 2015. I was in NATO and the NATO Defense Policy and Planning Committee, the German speaker in these years when we started with NATO's adaptation. In 2014, we were very badly prepared for collective defense at the high end, coming from these 3 decades of crisis management and not much more. Today, we are here really with brigade-size formations in the countries. We are here with divisions in the build-up process. In Germany, 2 of them to be available for NATO, 1 for the Baltic states defense, 1 for operational reserve and counterattack in Poland. So there is a huge effort, including in Germany, to rebuild a credible deterrence and defense posture. We would now be able to defend the Baltic states as opposed is in 2014. And we have the Baltic Sea now more or less largely in NATO's hand with the accession of... Yeah, right. Exactly. And the other point is that role, especially in Germany, of being the hub for all logistical support, getting American forces, large forces, in Bremerhaven or in the Netherlands, in bringing them quickly, within days and a few weeks across Germany to the frontline states in a crisis, in an emerging crisis. And we also need, of course, much better than so far, be prepared in resilience building in the societies, in civil-military cooperation in the transition from peacetime to crisis to conflict, as we had it done in the 1980s and 90s. And we need to reinvent these large-scale procedural exercises called Vintex-Simex, where from Brussels headquarters across all capitals, across the major county capitals in Germany or in Poland, down to the lowest level, to organize that, build up of forces and all that more faster than the other side, the Russians could do it. That is all underway. And the Finns, with their accession, are a great add-on to all that. By the way, they have 900,000 reserves, trained reserves. And they give the Baltic states the operational depth in the sea space and in the air space to really be able, as NATO as a whole, to successfully defend conventionally without having any need to recur here to nuclear forces.
Thank you. Thank you. I see another question, please.
All this. My name is Karlis Kruškevics. I'm from Washington, D.C., a Latvian American. I have a question specifically about nuclear missile defense. I recently read an article from an expert about if there was a nuclear missile launched, I guess in this case, targeting the United States, that the U.S. missile nuclear defense would only be 50% effective, even in perfect conditions. So I guess my question is, if Russia, for example, was to launch a nuclear missile, would we be able to intercept it or to stop it?
We're going into very classified information, but maybe just from the doctrinal perspective, someone could, general, from the most military person here.
I give you an example. 10, 15 years ago, we saw the nuclear threat coming from so-called rogue states, such as Iran, in case they continue with their nuclear program and also with their missile program. So, and we got very clear indications from the Americans we need to do something against, and they were prepared to protect their European allies, not against the first and second strike capability of the Russians, but against that very limited growing up capabilities of Iran with the Aegis cruisers and all that. And with what we have seen there is that the probability to intercept a few, and the Iranians have not more but just a few in that scenarios, to intercept them successfully. First remark. Second remark, with the Russians and the Americans, both sides have assured second strike capability. That means if you put all your defenses against strategic ICBMs and all that active, you need to know some will come through, and both sides know it. So there is a mutual assured destruction for these nuclear superpowers. Third element, conventionally, look at air defense in Ukraine. From the low-level drones or against drones to the cruise missiles to the tactical missiles with conventional warheads, all that. I think the ability to intercept all that is remarkably high. It is what I took from the media, somewhere though 80, 50, 85, 90%. And what we are doing in Germany now, our Chancellor has initiated the European Sky Shield initiative for Central Europe. That means we intensify and increase our three-layer defense based on German IRIS-T systems, on Patriot enhanced ones, I mean PAC-3 ones, and plus on top American and Israeli, Arrow 3. And we have invited all our neighbors to join us in that effort. So you need a strong defense, but you will always have a hole in that. So you need also a credible counter threat to tell them, don't do it. We can strike back if it is required.
Thank you, General. I see the time is clicking again, and we have 10 minutes and time for one question, please. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Gustos. and I just have a general interest in international relations and politics. And my question, it can be directed at anyone, but mostly at Madam Braže. And I wanted to ask two questions, really. First one is, what is NATO's nuclear response always going to be in self-defense? And the second question is, this is more from practical perspective, if NATO decided to use nuclear response, would it be a collective agreement, or is it possible that the countries that hold the nuclear weapons, they could possibly go out without support from some other countries?
Thank you. Please.
There's a process called nuclear planning, which is where the allies sit together. It's minus France. Again, France is not part of the nuclear planning because of the independent nature of its nuclear deterrent. So that is a process where allies sit together and they get very clear understanding of what are indications, warnings, what is the process, what is the decision making, because at the end you want the risk to be shared, because if there is a risk, nuclear weapons risk, that risk is shared among all allies. So that is where a sort of collective decision making comes in. Again, I wouldn't speculate about concrete situations, about scenarios, etc. So it will depend. If we make sure that, we have to make sure that it never comes to that. So that's why not only the capability and resolve and demonstrated resolve on the ability to respond, on ability in the same time to engage and to have that critical sort of transparency element and verification in place is important. But also that would mean that something so serious has happened that the whole escalation ladder has gone to something else. So it wouldn't happen just suddenly sitting here in CESIS and there is something happening. It's part of the wider process. So this is where my answer lies. That's as much as I can say in public. But again, you have to rest assured that there is both the collective process to manage the risk, there's capabilities, there's resolve, but also there is a huge investment in indications and warnings to understand what is happening on the other side.
Thank you. I see we have 8 minutes. So for two of you, 2 to 3 minutes. What can we do to exclude any kind of possibility?
Can I ask a question to the audience? How many of you trust NATO to be a responsible nuclear actor? Can you lift your hands up? Okay, we have a very dedicated audience here. How many do you believe that NATO and the allies have that capability and resolve to deter and defend? I think we're good, huh? At least here. We're okay. In my polling, it's always 75–80%, but here it's 100%.
Okay, gentlemen, what should we do to exclude any kind of miscalculations or possibilities in this regard, to not even trying to test? What else should we do?
For me as a German, it is very simple, and I tell this message to my politicians time and again in Berlin. We need to keep our word which we have given in NATO, and we need to keep our promises as delivered in 2014 at the Wales Summit, 2%, 3 divisions, what we increased at the Warsaw Summit in 2016. So it's about implementation. We need to be firm in really turning into reality what we have committed in NATO. That is the German part to play. And that will lead to a really substantial contribution for collective conventional defense in Central Europe and in Northeastern Europe in particular, which is our focus area. And we expect the others then to do the same. The Brits in Estonia, the Canadians here, the Americans everywhere, so to speak. And with the Americans on board, I'm quite confident. And we need to keep the Americans as long in Europe as possible. And that means we need to be serious as Europeans in burden sharing 50-50 at least. Otherwise, we may lose them. And that is what we cannot afford, especially not in the nuclear umbrella, the American extended deterrence, because their focus is shifting to the Indo-Pacific against China. So it's in our hands to do more on European defense, including the Germans in particular, in order to avoid an American reduction of their engagement for Europe's security.
Thank you. Imants?
Yeah, I think that just as a follow-on, I think it's right that from Washington's perspective, you know, the bigger threat that they're now seeing comes from China, which doesn't mean to say that they're not able to, of course, devote the time and energy, and they're still in the lead of countries within the alliance that are supporting Ukraine, you know, in the defense of its country. And so I think there is scope for Latvia and other countries to really try to help to find out how we can also move towards supporting the United States in what they're doing in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think here there is scope for us to increase our knowledge of what the threat as they perceive it, as the United States perceive it in that region to be, mainly of course from China, the attacks on democracy, where Taiwan is clearly in the same situation as Ukraine in its defense of values and standards, or you know, and potentially under attack. So I think that's where specifically, you know, we could also contribute in trying to ensure there is unity amongst the allies. And we also, I think it's important, this whole issue of NATO's extension to the region, and whether there will be a NATO office based in Japan, for example. Recently there have been contradictory remarks about that. So those are the types of things that I perceive to be important.
And final word.
The NATO's center of gravity is unity of allies on everything. The defense planning, the defense posture, the policies that we implement. But it also concerns our societies. It's very important for our societies within NATO to understand Russian doctrine, Russian warfare doctrine, where a lot of work is devoted to unconventional, so hybrid methods. The influence operations, the active measures that have been there since the establishment of the Soviet Russia and then Soviet Union and then again Russia. It's all there. The wish to co-opt people as high as possible in political, in business environments, in political parties, split societies, create animosity among various social groups, the ability of governments to have trust of their citizens. Also, governments obviously are responsible very clearly of being transparent, accountable to its citizens. The preparation of certain conventional operations through penetrating currently data, cyber networks, everything else, stealing of information, hacking and leaking. It's all of part of Russia's doctrine. It's just being adjusted to the current times. And I think for our societies in NATO, it's very, very important to understand and to be literate, to be resilient, to be able to calibrate it to them, to analyze and act accordingly. The resilience also includes, as General Tufelde said, a very practical exercises at the municipalities and lower levels, at the enterprise levels, trying out crisis exercises, having that digital literacy, cyber hygiene, information hygiene. So trying that out among your collectives, you know, making sure that you take it seriously, those crisis management exercises is important. It prepares both in the head but also in the processes, all of us, to be able to be stronger, to be more resilient. It doesn't mean that the war is coming, no, but it's for our own benefit. Trust in the conscription, ability to be in reserve, committing yourself to actually learn more about security and defense. It all forms part of it. So there's, you know, NATO as a big collective united strength of us all. that has a transatlantic nature and that ultimately guarantees our security. But there is so much to do among the societies, both in private and public sector. So that is my ask to all of you, to actually become these ambassadors in your groups, in your societies, because you obviously have the interest about these issues, and make sure that you speak to your friends and ask them to become part of that resilient societies that we need in these conditions.
Thank you, colleagues, and I would argue, and I will conclude with that, that on the stage of enlighten, we have lightened the elephant in the room, and what we witnessed during also our conversation, that elephant is not so scary, not so big one, right? We have to speak about that. That's normality. He is there. We cannot, or she, or maybe she or he or they are there, and we have to speak about that. We have to be ambassadors of that. We have to enlighten, we have to raise awareness of such issues. And thank you, colleagues, for joining and being on this hot seat position, literally and mentally, because speaking about the nuclear weapons is not an easy task, especially if you are in the position of Assistant Secretary General, mixing feelings about the classified and unclassified information that you can share. So thank you, and thank you for the audience for joining and being with us. So join me in the round of applause. Thank you.